Between 1978 and 1980, Throbbing Gristle's Industrial Records label published 4 issues of a newsletter called Industrial News. Among the written articles, artworks and performance dates was a listing and contact details for musicians who had sent Industrial cassettes of their own music. This list was published under the heading Tapes Received. But we wanted to know what was on the tapes and what happened to the young generation of artists who sent them.
Almost all of the artists were unknown at that time, but many went on to fame. Many others were never heard from again and remain a mystery. Undoubtedly, some of these artists just made a forgettable racket, but given the number of excellent artists on the list, it has left some people wondering about those unknowns.
This is Cassette Culture.
General Idea, who were based in Toronto, did a magazine called File. And amongst it, in one of their issues, was about 6 pages that were yellow paper, and it was called the Image Bank Request List. And in it, there were literally maybe 2,000 artists' names, and you could give your name and your mailing address, and then you could request images of what you needed for your work.
We started writing to people. It was like being given a gift, really.
And sending handmade things. The whole idea was that you were avoiding the galleries, you were avoiding commerciality, you were giving a gift to another artist.
And so word got around, and people would write to you and say, you know, we're doing this. How do you fancy doing some little thing with us? It was a good time, and it was really accelerated what we were doing in terms of who we were meeting and the opportunities that were sort of presented to us as well. Yeah, it sort of exploded.
By the mid-70s, the performance art actions of Coum Transmissions had encompassed mail art, the sending of collages and small artworks through the mail to other artists around the world. But in 1975, the UK Post Office had filed a court case against Genesis P. Orridge for sending indecent and offensive material through the postal network. The conclusion of this trial coincided with the end of Coum and the start of Throbbing Gristle, launched in 1976 at their final exhibition, Prostitution, at the ICA in London.
Later in the year, the ICA had another in its long-running Let's Make You Sick series. This was called Prostitution and featured all the tools of the trade and the leftovers. Its star and creator was a Mr. Genesis P. Orridge.
Basically, all it says is a very simple thing, which is that to know a person, you have to meet them. You can't go by second-hand information about a person.
When the Arts Council annual report was published, the chairman, Lord Gibson, said he deplored the events at the ICA, even if he was paying for them.
Future Industrial Records collaborator, artist Val Denham, recalls hearing about the exhibition.
I'd seen one of those tabloid newspapers, and there was a piece in there about should the Art Council be paying for art, which is basically pornographic. And it was the Prostitution show at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London, done by Coum, and it was Genesis P. Orridge and Cosy Fanny Tutor. And then eventually I met this guy in Leeds. I was selling some work to somebody, some of my artwork, for ridiculously cheap money. And we met in a pub, and one of the guys there was called Biggles. And Biggles used to be part of Coum Transmissions. And he said, have you ever met Genesis P. Orridge? And I said, no. I said, but I read an article. I said, but in the article, it didn't say whether that person was male or female. And he said, oh, no, it's a guy, yeah. You must meet Genesis. You'll get on really well. He'd love your artwork. Because I was doing pretty strange artwork at the time. A lot of artwork to do with serial killers, Manson family and God knows what. So I wrote in this letter, and the intention of the letter was just to freak him out, just quite a perverse thing to do, really. So I wrote this letter with lots of references in that only somebody who was, close would know, and certain phrases that he would use and this, that and the other. Of course, I got it all off of Biggles, but he didn't know that. And I put a photograph of myself in, not saying if I was male or female. And so he wrote back and he said, will you come and see me, in London? Because at that time I lived in Leeds with my parents. And I said, I can't afford the fare, I can't afford the coach or the train down. So he sent me 200 quid in the post, in a packet. So I went down and I stayed with him for a week.
In 1978, the first issue of Industrial News appeared. The standard practices of the mail art world were influential, as Industrial News began listing the names and addresses of people who'd corresponded with them. The first tapes received list was out. Philip Sanderson of Storm Bugs talks about how he contacted TG just as he was about to launch his own label, Snatch Tapes.
Well, I've had some correspondence with TG prior to the newsletter. I got their address through a guy, I think he was called Alan, and there were two people who used to stand either side of the stage in kind of military fatigues, looking quite serious. It turns out that one of them, Alan, lived in Rochester, which is where I had grown up and where Stephen Ball, fellow Stormbug, was still living. And we went round the year that the first TG album came out. We went round there and listened to it, sitting on his carpet. But yes, I had a little bit of correspondence with them and used to occasionally ring them up. And inevitably Genesis would answer. I think on one occasion, Cozy answered, and she said, I'll get Jen for you. The pretext for these calls was usually something about when the next record or gig or whatever was coming out. And Genesis, Jen, could talk for Britain. He'd launch off and regale you with various tales and anecdotes and scraps of philosophy and so on. I think at that point, their fan base was quite small. So, yeah, they used to write back to everybody. And so I was sort of on the mailing list when Industrial News came out.
While Industrial News was introducing its audience to the Throbbing Gristle universe, it was also introducing them to each other by publishing contact details. And not just in the UK. There were contacts listed from all around the world, including Japan, USA and Australia. A new generation of musicians rallied under the TG banner, including Funeral Danceparty. Richard Rupenus wrote to us with his story.
I'd seen in earlier issues of Industrial News that TG was interested in receiving demos, so I thought this would be another way of receiving further exposure. However, I was under no delusions that we'd be offered a recording contract with Industrial Records or anything like that. But I thought if our address was included in the mag, that would greatly increase our circle of contacts, which it did.
You're sinking down further. Sleepier. Some of these changes will come rapidly. Some of them will take a little time, but you'll become aware of a quiet and growing confidence in yourself. Because you will realize you're not losing energy, not fusing it off intentions, not worrying. You'll find that you will be more decisive, that you can deal with what has to be done with and then push it aside. You are going to have a mental and emotional control because you are getting the cooperation of your unconscious mind. Quiet and easily.
I just compiled a selection of tracks which I considered to be our strongest material. I was very surprised, and I'm rather embarrassed to admit, excited. In my defence, I was just an impressionable teenager at the time, to receive a letter from Genesis P. Orridge saying it's one of the best tapes we've received. He listened to all of it. Like Mal at Cabaret Voltaire, Genesis suggested that we self-finance and release a record and enclose the details on how we'd go about it. However, for various reasons, that didn't happen. Incidentally, Genesis concluded by saying that his copy of the cassette had, unfortunately, been destroyed, but requested if we did put out a record to make sure that we sent him one. In 1980, United Dairies were keen to release a funeral dance party LP, but stipulated that it had to be recorded in a proper studio. We intended to record the album at a very expensive 24-track studio in Newcastle. However, this was abandoned following only one disastrous session. I say disastrous because the engineer was only familiar with rock and pop music and had absolutely no clue about anything else. The first thing he asked was, "Where's your drum kit?" And it all went rapidly downhill from there.
Val Denham would later use her visual art talents to create striking collage gig flyers and posters for TG. But she'd also become inspired to experiment with sound and tape loops after spending time with Genesis.
About 1979, I just started to experiment with tapes. Now, when I say experiment, the first experiments I did were just really bad, crude, amateur. All I had was one cassette recorder, which I'd had since the mid-1970s, and it had a microphone. I had an acoustic guitar and I used to twang that. And I was interested in trying to make sounds myself because of this music that I was listening to, like, Coum and Pierre Robot, etc., etc. So I used to do tapes like that, and I made one tape and I sent it to Genesis. This is when I was living back in Yorkshire with my parents. And the tape that I sent him, I did dialogue in between the tracks, pieces of music, if you can call it music, that I was doing. And it was probably, I think I know which one it was, yeah. this stuff on, and he listened to it with Sleazy, Peter Christopherson, and he thought it was just brilliant. In fact, they liked it so much that they said they were going to release it on Industrial Records, the full tape, as an album. And he played it to Cozy and Chris Carter, and they said, we are not releasing that on Industrial Records. But it never happened, no. So I was first doing tapes like that until I got interested, more and more interested in how can I improve this? So what I did was I bought, I think, about 6 cassette recorders, small ones with microphones. And what I would do is I would put an earpiece in one cassette recorder and play something, or attempt to play something like a piece of guitar or whatever, and record it. And then I would do another one with some sort of percussion or whatever. And then I would do another one with some sort of, I don't know, wind instruments or whatever. And I would try and synchronise them all together, all 6 recorders, and record them onto one good tape recorder that I eventually got, which was a stereo one, and try and synchronise them. Of course, I couldn't possibly synchronise them. It's impossible. Sometimes when I did 2 recorders at once and I synchronised it perfectly, it sounds so good. But then, because it's a different recorder, it goes slightly out of line and you get this flanging effect, you know. So I got more and more elaborate, and then I worked out that if you unscrewed a cassette and took all the tape out and just had enough tape to go around the spools, I got a little splicing kit from a place called Tandy's. And if you cut the tape at an angle, just like that, you could stick it at the back with some special tape, and you could just make a tape loop. And I got some brilliant tape loops. So you could just bang on a piece of sheet metal or whatever, and it'd just go over and over and over. Well, that would be one tape recorder going there. And then I would do some guitar on the next tape recorder, and so on and so forth. Sometimes even just as this is all playing and I'm trying to record it onto the stereo recorder, I would sing as well into the microphone as it was recording.
The sky turned blue, then red.
When I left Bradford College, I went down to London, and that was 1979, and that was to go to the Royal College of Art. So when I went down, I met like-minded people who were interested in similar sorts of alternative music, you could say. And I met Throbbing Gristle and John Balance, or Jeff Rushton as it was known then. So we used to go see people like the Virgin Prunes, the Lieback, all these sorts of bands, you know.
When I look through the sky, I wonder why.
One person that got in touch with me was Andrew Mackenzie of the Haffler Trio. And I went up to Darlington, which is north, and I stayed with him for a week, and he had a reel-to-reel, and we did lots of experimental tapes that ended up on an album just called The Death and Beauty Foundation, which you can still get now. And incidentally, it was once in a list of the 20 strangest albums ever made. Yeah, and it is darn strange as well. It was never released. We just did it as an experiment for ourselves, and it was only about 10 years later it got released.
In my blue red sky, in my blue red sky.
And then in the 1983, something like that, I started doing album covers for Marc Almond, Marc and the Mambas. That came about because he kind of remembered me, and he found out that I was at the Royal College of Art. So he came to my degree show with a load of people, all the people from Some Bizarre Records, Steve and Marc Almond and Genesis came along. And Marc Almond was blown away by my artwork, and then he sort of gave me a phone call and he said, would you do my album cover? And I said, yeah, sure, yeah, why not? So I said, what do you want me to do? And he said, I just want you to do whatever you want to do, And he said, I'll send you a tape and you can listen to the music. It was called Untitled, the album. And he said, you listen to a tape of the album and just paint whatever you want, I didn't even listen to the tape. I go by intuition, I just feel it, And I just painted a picture of him sort of looking all religious and almost like a saint with a halo and everything. And he loved it. And that was it. So I did a lot of things for Marc Almond, And we were also both friends with Genesis P. as well. And I was doing record covers for, Psychic TV and Throbbing Gristle and such like.
There was a Storm Bugs tape, and I also thought I'd send in a Vote Police tape, as I was using both monikers at the time. This would have been early primitive stuff. Certainly the Vote Police was probably material that I'd recorded at home on those flea market bought reel-to-reel machines. Storm Bugs could have been material that you then hear on Snatch 1, or it could have been even pre that. So if your name was published in there, Storm Bugs, Vote Police, and people then subsequently saw an entry in DIY corner or garage land, the chances are they would start to write to you. Certainly by late 79, 80, I was receiving a lot of tapes. I got friendly for a short while with the Lemon Kittens. Now, their address, I believe, was published in the Second Industrial News. When Genesis died, an attempt was made to see if these tapes submitted still exist. His archive was donated to the Tate Gallery. I eventually got in touch with the guy who'd been responsible for supervising this donation, and there's the manifest, which is the list, and very kindly, after a few weeks, he went through the manifest to see if any of the tapes submitted, not just the Storm Bugs ones, but any of the submitted tapes were there. And after much reaching around, the conclusion he came to was no, they weren't on that list. So Richard Rupenus was quite keen to track these tapes down as well, contacted Cozy, and slightly surprisingly, she came back and said no, when her and Chris Carter split from Genesis, that these tapes were not amongst the tapes that they had. So the question of whether these tapes still exist somewhere is open to question.
We'll continue searching for more artists who are listed in the Industrial News issues of 1979 and 1980. See you next time. In this episode of the Cassette Culture podcast, you heard the voices of me, Martin Franklin, Genesis P. Orridge, Cozy Fanituti, Philip Sanderson, and Val Denham. Richard Rupenus was read by Tim Nice. The music you heard was Untitled by Funeral Danceparty from side 1 of their QWERTY UEOP cassette, the BBC Newsbeat radio special from 1976. Swimming by Val Denham from her self-released cassette. Solely From by Storm Bugs from A Safe Substitute. Time is Money by Val Denham. Blue Red Sky by the Death and Beauty Foundation, released by Vinyl on Demand. Make Customers Matter by the Storm Bugs from the Table Matters EP. Untitled by Funeral Dance Party from A Celebration of Eye Death on Vinyl on Demand. Making this episode wouldn't have been possible without the support of Jerry Kranitz and Richard Rupenus.